Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me apologize for not being able to hear most of the hearing up to this point, but I'd like to ask a couple questions about the two bills. By the way, when I speak, I don't have questions that my staff wrote, but when I speak, you can see Craig's lips moving over there, and it's actually coming from him. But I have interest in the ETF bill, which Congressman Hill's been working on, and I'd like to be part of that and work with Mr. Duffy a little bit on the venture exchange bill. There seems to be some consensus that making greater access to research for ETFs makes a lot of sense. Is there anybody on the panel who disagrees with that? Did I miss anything? And so then my question would be, is there anything, it goes, I think, to the question that Mr. Schweikert just asked about how prescriptive legislation is. Is there anything in the draft legislation that has been developed that raises any concerns by any of the panelists?
Well, I've highlighted in my testimony essentially a laundry list of issues. One is the extent to which it departs from the basic foundation of Rule 139. Of greater concern is it provides a sweeping insulation from private liability, which I don't think was the author's intention. But if you look at the way the bill is drafted, it eliminates generally liability for the research reports to the extent that the liability depends on there being an offer.
The safe harbor provision. You think that there's an opportunity to clean that up or make it more reasonable?
Again, I would rather work from the point of view of asking the SEC to do a registered investment company exception, because the current departures from Rule 139 in the bill, I think, would be hard to fix, and it also would remove any flexibility the SEC would have going forward in changing the rule for the benefit of ETFs down the road. You do something in a statute, you essentially locked it in place, and the SEC would not be able to make it liberalize it or strengthen it in the future.
So you would argue for doing something less prescriptive rather than more, going back to the question from Mr. Sweat?
Yeah, less detailed, but I think if this is what you want, you tell the SEC to do it, and as Chairman Garrett suggests, you these days have to give them a timeline. Right.
Any other panelists have a different view of that? So a second question or second issue is venture exchanges. Mr. Duffy and I have been talking about that for some time, and know others as well. And we spend a lot of time back in our district, and I was talking to a woman who runs a large corporation pension fund and raised some concerns about it, which surprised me, frankly, with respect to starting a venture fund exchange, excuse me. What are concerns that any of the members of the panel might have on that idea?
Mr. Carney, not necessarily a concern. I think
her concern was basically that the unsophisticated investor could really be taken for a ride in a venture exchange.
Yeah. What I have in our testimony, and I also talked about in our oral statement, is that I think there needs to be the ability for the SEC and the exchange, right, when they're developing the system, to develop it in such a way that you have sufficient investor protections in place and they have sufficient systems in place to allow that exchange to operate. I think we can get at those concerns through that process. Additionally, as I said—
Through the process of setting up the exchange itself?
Through the process of setting up the exchange. But then the reason why we also asked for a prospective prospective study on it is to take a look at it in a date certain in the future, to see how the venture exchange is operating, if there are changes that need to be made, and then also to see how it's operating in competition with the OTC markets, with ATS systems, to see how that's all working. So I think we have two bites at the apple to take care of those concerns.
Good. Mr. Burton?
I think that maybe your constituent didn't fully understand the proposal, which is understandable because it just got
I explained it to her.
The venture exchange is really a question of how you structure the marketplace. The individual investor can go buy those stocks because they're public companies on OTC markets over their E-Trade or Ameritrade account today. Right? And the way the proposal is structured would also include the new Regulation A+ securities, but they also have quite a bit of disclosure and probably are going to become tradable as well. So I think the investor protection core of it, particularly the fraud rules at both the state and federal level, but also the disclosure rules at the federal level, are sound. And that's not really what the legislation addresses. It addresses the structure of the marketplace and how that can be changed to make smaller capitalization firms have a better secondary market, which will help investors, not hurt them, because they'll have a more liquid market where they can sell their securities when they need to, and they're more likely to get a better price.
Thanks so much. I see. I'd love to hear your response, but I'm out of time.
Thank you.
Yield back.
The gentleman yields back.